Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This is part 2 of my series, Fraud in the National Climate Assessment. Imagine a courtroom where only the prosecution was allowed to be heard and the defense was never allowed to speak. Every trial would end in a conviction. That's exactly what the scientists in the National Climate Assessment are doing. Only one side of the debate is allowed to speak, the climate alarmists. The lack of dissenting voices allows nonsensical pages like this one from the National Climate Assessment to slip through. In my previous video, I showed you what was wrong with the U.S. heat wave graph, and in this one I'm going to show you what's wrong with the Arctic sea ice extent graph. If there was any actual peer review going on in climate science, this sort of nonsense would never be able to get through. Let me explain. This graph shows the Arctic sea ice extent steadily declining since the year 1979, down almost 50% from where it was back then. So it seems like a pretty safe bet that the Arctic is going to be ice-free before too much longer. The National Climate Assessment Arctic sea ice graph is derived from this one from NOAA, showing 1979 down to the present, linear trend downward. Obviously, the Arctic is doomed. But now I'm going to show you what's wrong with this graph and why it's terribly misleading. The text says summer extent was the sixth lowest and winter extent was second lowest in the satellite record from 1979 to 2018. So NOAA says the satellite record began in 1979, the year the graph starts, and they show sea ice declining downwards from there. Sounds convincing except for the fact that it isn't true. This is a paragraph from the sea ice section from the 1990 IPCC report. That's the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It says, satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. The American Navy Joint Ice Center has produced weekly charts which have been digitized by NOAA. So NOAA now claims that satellite sea ice records began in 1979, but the 1990 IPCC report shows that isn't true. They actually had charts from satellite data going back to the early 1970s. And if you look at the bottom sentence here, you can see why they're hiding it. It says, in 1972 to 1975, sea ice extent was significantly less. This is the Arctic sea ice extent graph from the 1990 IPCC report. And I've marked in red here the satellite data which NOAA and the National Climate Assessment are now hiding. You can see that sea ice extent was much lower. They start their graphs right here at the peak in 1979. Once again it says data from NOAA. NOAA's hiding their own data. By hiding the section of the graph where sea ice extent was increasing, they can make it look like there's a steady decrease, when in fact it's cyclical behavior. It went up, and now it's going down. Most of the rest of this video is going to be devoted to showing you exactly what information NOAA and the National Climate Assessment are hiding from you and why they're doing it. In 1971, National Geographic published this map of Arctic sea ice. It shows Arctic sea ice extends several hundred miles offshore everywhere except against the coast of Greenland and Canada, where the winds push it up against the shoreline. Now let's compare the 1971 National Geographic map to the 1981 minimum extent from the National Snow and Ice Data Center on September 16, 1981. Note that the ice edge is much closer to the shore than it was at the end of summer in 1971. This animation flashes back and forth between the 1971 ice edge and the 1981 ice edge at the summer minimum. Note that there was a large expansion of the ice edge between 1971 and 1981. It moved out hundreds of miles, and that's exactly the data which NOAA and the National Climate Assessment are hiding from you by not showing you the pre-1979 data. In this map, I overlaid the 1981 ice edge on the 1971 National Geographic map. You see the 1981 edge here in yellow and the 1971 edge in white. You see there was a large expansion in ice. And even more interesting is this pink median line. This pink median line shows where the National Snow and Ice Data Center considers to be the normal ice edge for mid-September. But you can see that in 1971, the ice edge shrunk way back past there. So there was a lot less ice in 1971 than what they claim now is normal. The data prior to 1979 is very inconvenient for alarmists. In fact, it wrecks their scam, so that's why they're hiding it. And that's really pretty ridiculous. This is a photograph taken by one of the Apollo missions, Apollo 16, from 1972, showing Arctic sea ice. We went to the moon in 1969. How could they possibly expect that we wouldn't have satellite sea ice records prior to 1979? It makes no sense. This is a 1965 National Geographic article which shows satellite imagery of Arctic sea ice from 1964, 15 years before NOAA and the National Climate Assessment claim the satellite record began. And here's another National Geographic satellite image from 1975 showing tremendous detail of Antarctic sea ice. And another thing that's really interesting about this is that there was almost no Antarctic sea ice left at the end of summer. This was in 1975 during the Ice Age scare. Let's have a closer look now at the weather of the 1970s. On July 18, 1970, the New York Times reported, U.S. and Soviet press studies of a colder Arctic. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice contributes to the onset of ice ages. Ooh, that sounds pretty scary. Global cooling, a new ice age, ominously thickening ice. But wait a minute, this was 1970 when the ice extent was really low. So the ice had thickened and expanded a lot by 1970, but it was still much lower than it was in 1979 and 1981. So the 1970s must have been really cold if the ice expanded that much from 1970 to 1979. And yes, it was. Sunday, March 2nd, 1975, the Chicago Tribune. Brr, new ice age on way soon. In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snowcap has expanded 12%, and for the first time in this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. That tells us that the 1970s was the coldest period of the last century around Iceland. Then the article goes on, many climatologists see these signs as evidence that a significant shift in climate is taking place, a shift that could be the forerunner of an ice age, like that which gripped much of the northern hemisphere before retreating 10,000 years ago. It's not hard to see why the National Climate Assessment and NOAA don't want you to know about the 1970s. The ice was expanding ominously. It was very cold. There was a new ice age on the way. This pretty much ruins their story. In 1972, 42 of the leading American and European climate investigators met at Brown University, and they were so worried about an ice age that they sent a letter off to President Nixon warning of a new ice age in about a century. Now let's look at what was going on prior to the 1970s. This graph is from the 1985 Department of Energy report, projecting the climatic effects of increasing carbon dioxide. This group was the predecessor to the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The graph shows Arctic sea ice bottoming in the mid-1950s, then expanding through the 60s, dipped a little bit for a while, and then went way up, we know, in the late 1970s to the peak around 1979. This graph combines the 1985 DOE graph with the 1990 IPCC graph at the same scale on both the x and y axes. And you see something very interesting here. Look at this, 1979 was the peak year for the last century. So the National Climate Assessment and NOAA hide all the data prior to 1979, which shows that extent was much lower earlier in the century. But by starting the graphs here, they can create their fake linear trend downward, when in fact the climate is cyclical, not linear. Newspaper articles from the 1950s and 1940s confirm that ice extent was very low. New York Times, Sunday, October 19, 1958, 60 years ago. The changing face of the Arctic. Some scientists estimate that the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half century ago, and that even within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic Ocean may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole. So the New York Times was predicting an ice-free Arctic within a generation 60 years ago. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? This bottom paragraph is really interesting. Although the idea that a solid ice sheet covers the central Arctic has lingered stubbornly in the popular fancy, the northern cap of ice worn by our planet is actually a thin crust, on the whole only about 7 feet or 2 meters thick. So in 1958, the New York Times was debunking the same illusion which climate scientists are trying to convince you now. They want you to believe that before the SUV was invented, ice in the central Arctic was very thick. But it wasn't. It was only 7 feet thick in 1958. And here's a story from 1940. The North Pole is getting warmer. Polar temperatures are on an average 6 degrees higher than those registered by Nansen 40 years ago. Ice measurements are on average only 6.5 feet thick compared to 9.5 to 13 feet thick 40 years earlier. So the ice was about 2 meters thick in 1958 and 1940. Let's see what it is now. This is the current ice thickness map from the Danish Meteorological Institute, and shows that ice thickness in the central Arctic is now about, guess what, 2 to 3 meters thick, just like it was 60 years ago and 80 years ago. Now let's look at what was going on in the Arctic when sea ice was declining rapidly during the 1920s and 1930s. Here's an article from 1922 from the Monthly Weather Review. The Arctic seems to be warming up. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sail the seas around Spitsbergen in the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they've entirely disappeared. Last winter, the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast of Spitsbergen. So 100 years ago, the Arctic was experiencing a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures. And this story was reported all over the country in different newspapers, and in fact all over the world. Well, no wonder NOAA and the National Climate Assessment don't want you to know about this. This is very inconvenient and pretty much wrecks their story. So what about the 1930s and the 1940s? December 17th, 1939, glaciers melting over Greenland. All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting, declared Professor Hans Alman, Swedish geologist. He was a leading Arctic expert at the time. It may, without exaggeration, be said that the glaciers, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. February 18, 1952, polar ice thaw increasing, glaciers said to be melting. The glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years ago. This was said by Dr. Carlson, who was the leading American expert at the time. So we know that the Arctic was very warm and melting from the 1920s through the 1950s, and then in the 1960s and 1970s the ice expanded a lot. Now let's look at the NASA temperature graph for Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland, going back to the year 1900. You can see that Reykjavik warmed a lot from 1920 to 1940. Then it cooled a lot until, guess what year? 1979. 1979 was the coldest year on record in Iceland. And guess what? That's the same year which NOAA and the National Climate Assessment cherry-picked for their start year of Arctic sea ice. They don't want you to know about this warmth in the 1940s, do they? By starting their Arctic sea ice graphs during the coldest year on record, they can make it look like there's a linear trend in ice loss, when in fact if they'd gone back to the early part of the century, everyone would know that ice is cyclical. It decreased in the 1940s as temperature rose, and then it increased into the late 1970s as temperatures fell. And now ice is decreasing again as temperatures rise cyclically. But look, temperatures are no warmer now than they were in the 1940s. The goal of the National Climate Assessment is to demonize carbon dioxide, and if they showed you all the data, it just wouldn't work. Let's look at what's really going on in Iceland. This graph overlays the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation in red on the Reykjavik, Iceland temperature graph in blue. You can see there's a very close correlation. When the ocean cycles go up, so do temperatures. When ocean cycles go down, so do temperatures. So we can see that temperatures in Iceland correlate with ocean circulation, not with carbon dioxide. But that's not the story which the National Climate Assessment wants you to hear. So let's look at how NASA deals with this. Instead of acknowledging the facts of the matter, what they do instead is tamper with the data. This gold line shows the actual measured temperatures, but the black line shows what NASA reports to the public. They just got rid of the 1940s warming by simply erasing it. This is standard practice for government climate scientists. Instead of coming up with an accurate theory for what was going on in the past, they simply rewrite the past. Very Orwellian. Now let's fast forward to the present. We know that Arctic sea ice extent declined a lot from the peak in 1979 to about 2007, but over the last 12 years, there's been really no trend in the Arctic sea ice. Same story with Arctic sea ice volume from the Danish Meteorological Institute. There's really no trend in the ice volume over the last 12 years. There was a period of time from 1979 to 2007 when the ice was declining rapidly, but it's not doing it anymore. Now let's compare what's actually happened over the last decade to predictions from a decade ago. Expert, Arctic polar ice cap may disappear this summer, 2008. North Pole may be ice-free for first time this summer, National Geographic, 2008. Could all Arctic ice be gone by 2012? The Arctic is screaming, said Mark Cerise, senior scientist at the government Stone Ice Data Center in Boulder. This week, after reviewing his own data, NASA climate scientist Jay Zwally said, at this rate, the Arctic Ocean could be nearly ice-free by the end of summer of 2012. Arctic summer is ice-free by 2013. BBC News. This story from the Naval Research Lab. In the end, it will just melt away quite suddenly, Professor Peter Wadhams of Cambridge. So given that fact, you can argue that our projection of 2013 is already too conservative. I don't think the Arctic was ice-free in 2008, 2012, or 2013. Nobel Prize winner Al Gore, man whose sci-fi flick has been shown to every public school child in the world, said, Arctic sea ice may disappear by summer 2014. I don't think it disappeared in 2014. June 24th, 2008, Seth Bornstein, AP Science writer. James Hansen, the guy who started the global warming scare before Congress in 1988, echoing work by other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years, the Arctic will be free of sea ice in the summer. Representative Ed Markey, Democrat Massachusetts Committee Chairman, said, Dr. Hansen was right. 20 years later, we recognize him as a climate prophet. So 5 to 10 years from 2008, that's this year. The Arctic must be ice-free now. Well, here's today's Arctic sea ice map from the National Stone Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado. That's a lot of ice for being ice-free. Hansen only has 15 days left to melt the Arctic, and I don't think it's going to happen. Scientists at the National Climate Assessment want you to think that our knowledge about ice began in 1979, but we actually know quite a bit going back much earlier than that. These are glaciation maps from previous ice ages. As you can see, ice extended all the way down, completely covered Illinois and Indiana, and went down into Kentucky. That's quite a bit further south than it is now. Atmospheric CO2 is lower then than it is now, but it was also lower 6,000 to 7,000 years ago when the Arctic was actually ice-free. So sometimes when atmospheric CO2 is low, it's very cold and there's a lot of ice. And other times when atmospheric CO2 is low, it's very warm and there's no ice. It's almost like CO2 has no correlation with ice. Now let's look at Amundsen's Northwest Passage trip from 1903 to 1906. Amundsen said The Northwest Passage. I saw it open for my ship the first year of my voyage, but would not take advantage of the chance because that's not what he was there to do. So he could have gone all the way through the Northwest Passage in 1903. Now let's fast forward to this year. I was thinking about taking a Northwest Passage cruise, but it wasn't possible because the passage was blocked with ice. So the Northwest Passage was open in 1903 and is closed in 2018. Now let's plot those dates on a NASA temperature graph. The Northwest Passage was open in 1903 in what was supposedly one of the coldest years on record. The Northwest Passage was closed this year in what was supposedly one of the warmest years on record. So the story is that the Arctic is overheating and the Earth is overheating and all the ice is melting at an unprecedented rate. But there was less ice in the Northwest Passage in 1903 than there was this year. The whole story doesn't add up. I'm an engineer and a scientist, and I find most of government climate science to be farcical at best. Let's look now at what global warming is really all about. This is a tweet today from Elizabeth May, head of the Green Party in Canada and former head of the Sierra Club. Andrew, do you recognize that more Canadians are at risk due to the climate crisis than from criminals? I'm all for locking up criminals, but what do you do to keep Canada safe from fires, floods, drought, ice, storms, tornadoes, and sea level rise? Every religion has its flood myth, and the global warming religion certainly does. Because of man's carbon sins, we will be punished with sea level rise and fires, drought, ice, famine, floods. Every bad thing in the world is going to happen unless you repent of your carbon sins, pay your carbon taxes, and confess. And you also need to believe the climate prophets. That's the most important thing. The climate scientists who write things like the National Climate Assessment are our new prophets, and you must believe them, or terrible things will happen to us. And only the officially designated prophets of the climate religion are allowed to participate in things like the National Climate Assessment. Skeptical scientists with a more practical view aren't permitted to provide any input. Can you imagine how different that document would be if I was involved in the process? But as a heretic and an unbeliever, I could never be included in an official climate religion document like the National Climate Assessment. In the 19th century, Charles Mackay wrote an excellent book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And he said, "Men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one." In the 16th century, thousands of witches were burned at the stake for cooking the weather. They don't blame witches anymore. Now they blame climate skeptics and Republicans. It's my goal to deprogram people from the climate religion slowly and one by one, just as Charles Mackay said. You can help me out by getting this video to as many people as you can. It's up to all of us to end this climate scam and put an end to this ridiculous global warming religion. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.